Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulil Kareem amma ba'd. How is everyone doing this evening? All right. Has everyone gotten their coffee or tea? Yes? I see some people missing. What's going on in terms of their drink? Okay, fair enough. So before I get started in earnest, I wanted to just say a special thank you to Qamariya Restaurant, to Qamariya, the cafe itself, specifically to Aziz and Daniel. If you're out there, a special shout out to you guys. Appreciate you guys helping out. All right. This particular talk, as you can tell, is not a typical talk. It's going to be quite atypical because A, we're sitting at Qamariya, but more than that, instead of me just talking at you, hopefully this will be a lot more interactive because I want to also get your thoughts, your input, and, and make it more collaborative, if that makes sense. Is that okay with you guys? Yes? See, I'm already starting and you guys are already kind of slacking. All right. So, with that said, let me kind of give a broad outline of what I'm hoping that we can cover tonight. So first, I wanted to paint a picture of where we left off or some of the elements we didn't cover at the conference. So how many people were at the Christianity conference? I think most of you guys, right? Maybe I should have asked who is not at the conference. That's a better question. All right, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, I'm going to talk to you all later. No, I'm kidding. Okay, fair enough. That's a good mix, actually, because now I know the majority of people here, I can pick on them and see if they're paying attention at the conference, okay? So, the topic in and of itself, we were saying it's Gaza and the evangelical movement, okay? How it's going to be different than the conference is that in the conference, we went into some granular details related to denominations, Christian denominations specifically, and then we tied that to the Gaza movement and how that dovetailed into the evangelicalism. We're going to be following a very similar format, except tonight, I wanted to circulate the discussion or encompass the discussion over 3 questions. All right, now it's important that we have these 3 questions in the backdrop. All right, so the first question, and that's going to be that when we think about the evangelical movement, when we think about the support for Israel, and with the support for Zionism itself, you find that there is a deep apocalyptic framing. In other words, there's a framing which is from a vantage point of what we call end times events. So what's going to happen at the end? The return of Jesus, and so on and so forth. So the question arises, and what we're going to hopefully explore, is why is it that there's this apocalyptic framing when it comes to understanding basically theology. And we'll see, bidhnillah, that this apocalyptic understanding or the return of Jesus was not something that arose just in the 18th or 19th century. It actually was there from the very get-go. But so that's my first question. Why is there such a stress on apocalyptic framing? All right, everyone understand what I mean by apocalyptic framing? End times events, right? What happens at the end? The return of Jesus, etc. Alayhi salam. Okay, question number 2. And this is the one that I think we explored with some detail, and hopefully we'll explore a little bit better tonight. And that is, why did Christians shift from a relative, or rather I should say, an anti-Semitic worldview to a philo-Semitic worldview? Now, let me explain what I mean here. So basically, when we talk about anti-Semitism, there's certain concepts that arise in the mind. And so certain ways that it's been defined for us in the contemporary age that we live in. But what I'm talking about here is specifically limiting or quarantining the concept of Semitism to Jews only. Now, I know this will be a discussion, and we can open this up as to the word Semite, how it extends beyond just those who are the descendants of Isaac or Ishaq, etc. But for this purpose, for this question, when I say anti-Semitic, I'm talking anti-Jewish, is what I'm specifically referring to. How did a worldview that historically for 1800 years was anti-Semitic based on the definition I just gave, how did that go from an anti-Semitic worldview to a philo-Semitic worldview? Now, what do I mean by philo-Semitic? So the word philo comes from the love of something. So if you know the word philosophy, it's philosophy. Sophie is wisdom, philo, the love of wisdom. So philo-Semitism is a love of Semitism. Or let's say an overwhelming adoration and almost borderline worship of Semitism or Semitic people, all right? And the third question, which is going to be linked to these two questions, and especially the last one, and it may seem a bit strange, but it's something that we have to unravel, and that is the question of who is a Jew and what is Judaism? Because for you and I, in our common vernacular, it may seem very straightforward. A Jewish person is X who has a certain, let's say, racial or ethnic backdrop, a bloodline, or whatever it may be. But what we're going to see is that this very question, who is a Jew, what is Judaism, runs a line throughout all of Christianity. It's something that's being struggled with in the beginning and all the way down to where you have the onset or the advent of the Zionist movement itself, all right? So those are our three questions. All right, so now I get to do the interactive part. See who's paying attention. What was my first question? See, who was taking notes? Let's see that. What was the first question? Sorry? What was I? No, it was not. Yes.
The Isa alayhi salam in the apocalyptic time.
Very good. The end times events and the return of Isa alayhi salam. Why is there a framing that runs through Christianity from its theology to its biblical understanding, etc.? So that was my first question. What was the second question?
How to go from anti-Semitic to philo-Semitic.
Right. How do we go from an anti-Semitic worldview to a philo-Semitic worldview? And the third question?
Who are Jews and what is Judaism?
Who is a Jew and what is Judaism? Okay. Let me now kind of bring us to why this is important. Why am I talking about this topic and why now? And I wanted to actually quote verbatim the confirmation hearing to Mike Huckabee. Not the whole thing. Obviously, that was 2.5 hours long. I'm not going to quote the whole thing, but just some snippets. All right. So as you may or may not know, does anyone know who Mike Huckabee is? Yes? Who is he?
Senate, governor.
Governor? He was a governor, correct. Anyone know specifically?
She's now the ambassador to be...
He's now the ambassador to Israel, right? But at his hearing, at his confirmation hearing, when he was put before the committee to decide whether he would be a good ambassador to Israel, he had a pre-prepared statement and then took questions for a good 2 or 2.5 hours. So in his pre-prepared statement, I wanted to read a snippet of that. And here's what he says. And this is why I think it'll be important for us, just as for us to frame our discussion. Now, by the way, when did this hearing happen? Anyone know? The date, or not the date, but was it recent? Was he become ambassador of Israel 2 years ago? When was it? After Trump was elected, correct, right? So it was this year, right? Maybe February, March, something like that. So he says, and this is, I'd like you to pay attention to this. Since 1948, when Israel was finally recognized as an independent Jewish state, it has been under attack for its existence. And one point here, one thing I'd like you to do, especially if you're going to be taking part in more Sapiens programs, is really try to see what are the presuppositions. What are the underlying assumptions in what he's saying? It's very important. In order to understand a person's worldview, their Weltanschauung, as is said in German, you have to understand what are the presuppositions or what are the assumptions that they're building a case upon, right? So, again, since 1948, when Israel was finally recognized as an independent Jewish state, it has been under attack for its existence. It is noteworthy that the first nation to recognize Israel was the United States. When our President Harry S. Truman, did so within minutes of its being constituted as an independent state. President Truman had been taught in his Independence, Missouri church, so he's from Independence, Missouri, the lessons of Genesis 12, that those who bless Israel will be blessed and those who curse Israel will be cursed. President Truman would later say he believed the teaching of his mother and grandmother and desired for America to be blessed, and we have been. Now, this was in his pre-prepared statement. When someone questioned him about the support for Israel, why that's important, why he would make a good ambassador, here's what he says. And this is something that if you come from an Islamic worldview and you have some sort of familiarity with the Quran and the verbiage of the Quran, this might kind of strike a chord. So he says, Israel in many ways is a reflection of our own heritage and history. Who is he talking about? The United States. It's a reflection of us, basically. It is the Judeo-Christian law that there is a right and a wrong path upon which all of Western civilization is built, but certainly our system of government. There is no country across the globe, that mirrors, that more mirrors our own struggle and our own level of democracy than does the state of Israel. It's one of the reasons that it is a natural ally. Now here's the take-home point. The spiritual connections between your church, mine, many churches across America, Jewish congregations to the state of Israel is because we are ultimately people of the book. We believe the Bible, and therefore that connection is not geopolitical. It is also spiritual. Okay, now there's a lot that's encapsulated in what he said. What are some of the things that stood out for you guys before I carry on? And I kind of highlighted certain aspects of it. So what stood out?
He's invoking the spiritual connection more than the seemingly geopolitical connection that runs in the news headlines.
Sure, okay, so he's linking the spiritual connection, perhaps giving it more credence than the, you could say like the secular backdrop. Okay, all right, what else? Who knows anything else? Very good, it's an aqidah issue. It's a, what do you call it, a worldview, an issue of his deen, is, you know, where he's coming from, the lenses by which he's looking at reality. Okay, what else? A bit louder, sorry.
The U.S. will continue to be successful as long as it continues to support
The U.S. will continue to be successful as long as they support Israel. Yes.
All the refugee start developing the church. That's where they get everything.
Very good. He said, he mentioned churches very specifically. He said, your church, my church, and churches across America, right? So he's linking it to a very specific group of people. Notice, and by the way, in his full testimony, to be fair, he did reach out and kind of what you would call give an olive branch to others that might be more of a secular leaning, right? But specifically in his pre-prepared statement and this section, I thought that was an important point as well. All right, anything else? Anything what I mentioned in terms of presuppositions?
I think along the lines of what Fatima said, subtly he's also saying whoever is not supporting Israel or not supporting the U.S.
Yeah, so those are undertones there as well. Your lack of support for Israel is a lack of support for the U.S., okay? There's one other thing that I want you to just appreciate, or at least understand, that there are, you know, this concept. You see, there's the religious connection, but he also invokes a type of a type of secular connection as well. Why? Because notice he says that the country that most mirrors the United States is Israel. And then he cites democracy. And by the way, there's a very interesting book that I got a hold of. It's called Christian Zionism 101. All right? And the title is 10 Reasons Christians to Support Israel and the Jewish People. You guys, I don't know, check it out. All right? All right. One of the reasons, I shouldn't say the first reasons, he lists all 10 of them. And actually, I don't want to misquote the guy, so let me just read the title. What he says in terms of one of the reasons, and it's linked to this point. He links it to democracy, because Israel is the largest and only democracy in the Middle East. Now, I want to ask a question. Is that statement true? Okay, why would you say it's not true? Okay, so one aspect is a quarter of the population, maybe more, don't participate. Okay, what else?
It's an ethnos.
Right, it's ethnocentric, right? So it's an ethno-state but can you be a democracy and an ethno-state at the same time? It's a question. I'll let you think about it. Yeah.
So being a apartheid state like Israel, to uphold the principles of democracy, those two are entirely contradicting things.
So to uphold a democracy and be an apartheid state.
Yeah, the same
Okay.
kind that's contradictory.
Okay, so here's the question. And there's a little bit of a historical backdrop. Is anyone familiar with Athenian democracy? The original democracy out of Athens. Anyone familiar with it? Sorry? Direct democracy, but Athenian democracy had certain limitations. In other words, you had to be male to vote in the democratic process in Athens, where democracy has its genealogical roots, right? So you had to be male. You had to be free. You couldn't be a slave, right? You had to be a citizen. How you define citizen, that's up for grabs, right? And yet, even though there were limitations on who could do the voting, it was still considered a democracy. So the retort, someone may come and say, well, look, that may be so, but it is still a democracy. Even if you limit it to a certain ethnic group, it's still a democracy. Now, the pushback to that, you could potentially say, is that, look, you just said it mirrors the United States. Was there a time in the United States that we had limited voting or the democratic process to a specific group of people? When was that? Sorry, nice and loud. 1920, okay, all right.
Before women got the right.
Okay, so you have women that were excluded by and large. What other group? African Americans were largely excluded. Do we have any group that's excluded today?
Yeah, prisoners.
Prisoners, right? So when we have these discussions and they say, look, it's the largest democracy, a quick answer might be like, no, it's an ethno-state. But what you really want to think through is, like, can you actually have an ethno-state, one that's specifically limited to an ethnic population, and still have a democracy? Because the argument could be made. Now, I'm not going to dwell upon that, but just something to think about as you have some of these discussions, hopefully where this is going. All right. I wanted to mention one other aspect of our current day and age, and that one's kind of right here at home. All right, and that's our dear Governor Greg Abbott. So, as you may or may not know, the city of San Marcos had put up a resolution to vote on whether funds of the city should be used for defense contracts for Israel. They were going to put that up as a vote. Now, Greg Abbott, he basically sent a very stern warning to the mayor. And here's what he said. And this is kind of, I'm quoting him. He said, Israel is a stalwart ally of the United States and a friend to Texas. I have repeatedly made clear that Texas will not tolerate anti-Semitism. All right, now there's an equivocation here, right? He's equating two things. If you speak up against Israel, you're speaking against Jews, right? But that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is his next statement. Anti-Israel policies are anti-Texas policies. Think about that for a second. So he's now threatened to pull funding, state funding, from San Marcos, okay? That threat, as it comes, what is he pulling funding for? He's pulling funding for the fire department, the police department, health, or in certain aspects, healthcare, housing, etc. So in other words, what he's saying, in a sense, is that his loyalty to Israel is at a higher level than his loyalty to Texas, if you really break it down, right? Okay, so with that sort of backdrop in place, let me start with our three questions. The first question I had mentioned, now someone remind me, what was the first question? Wait, not you guys. I know you guys are taking notes and stuff. Somebody else. What was the first question? The apocalyptic backdrop, framing. Okay, the apocalyptic backdrop and framing. So one of the things, and if you were here, if you attended the Christianity conference, we went through an extensive, you can say, history of Christian denominations, which I'm not going to repeat the entire thing, but we did go very early and we talked about the concept, or rather we talked about the difference between Paul and Peter. Does anyone remember what that difference was or what I talked about? What was the...
Is the previous Jewish law is...
Very good. Is the previous Mosaic or Jewish law abrogated? This was at the core of discussion. Now, you had two figures. Who wins out is Paul. In other words, that the Jewish law can basically be abrogated, and to be someone that's committed to Jesus and following the Christian way, you don't have to worry about the law. Okay, just to put it very simply in a simplified manner. Now, one of the aspects of Paul, when you read his writings, we know, for instance, that he was a celibate. He himself talked against marriage, spoke against marriage, was very virulent against the concept of divorce itself. And not only that, there's actually some researchers, although I don't agree with their research, that tried to claim that he was a homosexual because he has certain statements about which he said, you know, I had these feelings and so on, and I don't agree with that analysis. But the point is, one question that arises that he takes on is the question of, if the highest ideal is celibacy, how do you now increase the population of the Christian nation? So you've cut off the entire biological connection, okay? In other words, if the highest ideal is celibate, let's say everyone becomes celibate, no one is having marital relations, how do you now have more people, right? Eventually people are going to die, and that's it, khalas, you're done, right? His backdrop gives you a vantage point of where he was in this. Because he understood that the return of Jesus was imminent. In other words, it's coming, it's happening very quickly. He said it doesn't matter. If Jesus is returning soon, then it doesn't matter if we have families or not, because even if we do have families, you have children that are being born in the state of original sin anyway. So just to give you some backdrop on the concept of original sin. So as Muslims, we understand, for the Muslim understanding, or less the theological understanding, is that every human being is born upon something called the fitrah. Now that is a state of original goodness, you can say, right? As a technical definition, it's the original normative disposition. How you are originally, it's a state of goodness, a state of freedom, and a state of purity. That's why when a child is born, you don't look at it and say, look at that sinful little rat, right? You look at it and say, look at that innocent child, right? Naturally, that is something that we recognize. That's the Islamic understanding. When it comes to original sin, going back to Adam and Eve and the biblical narrative of that, because Adam, again, let's juxtapose that with the Islamic understanding, Adam alayhi salam and Hawa, they sinned, they turned to Allah, Allah teaches them how to ask for forgiveness. وَهُوَ التَّوَّابُ الرَّحِيمُ. He is the one that's ever turning in repentance and ever turning in forgiveness, and he forgives them, okay? The biblical understanding of that is that Adam was not forgiven, and that sin is now inherited. So children are born in a state of original sin. Now again, there's other nuances to that. I'm not going to explore that here because it's not a discussion on theology. But understand that when Paul says, if everyone's born in original sin anyways, you may not have the opportunity to believe in Jesus, and who knows what your state is, right? So it's not a big deal about families not being able to increase, not having a proliferation of families over time, and because children are born in a state of original sin, it's not a big deal anyway, okay? Why am I mentioning this? I'm mentioning this because we were talking about apocalyptic framing. As early as Paul, his framing is that Jesus is about to return. And in fact, when you read the narratives that are found in the New Testament, you get this sort of feeling that it's like, okay, so Jesus, as you guys who were part of the conference, when we talked about the entire timeline of events for Christians, right? Where we say that Jesus walked in to Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, so on and so forth. On Friday, Good Friday, he's taken, according to them, he was crucified. Sunday, which is Easter, he comes back, right? And so on. Now, that whole kind of timeline, one of the feelings you get when you read the biblical narrative is that once he's resurrected and he's then lifted, he ascends, if you remember, he's ascended and he's going to return. So this concept of the return of Jesus starts as early as Paul. the imminent return of Jesus, meaning he's just about to come. And what you find is that it's as early as Paul and extends all the way through till current day. So when we look at why is the framing apocalyptic, it starts early because it's as if Jesus is just about to return. And so, to put it in contemporary, I guess, flavor, it's like, he went away and he said, I'll be right back. Okay? You get that feeling, right? So if that's the case, and that's as early as Paul, you find that concept of the return of Jesus being present throughout all of Christian history, all the way until today. So that was my first question. Why is there such a stress on apocalyptic framing? And I mentioned why, how we know that from the time of Paul. And we're going to see that, we may see that, we'll explore that a little bit later as well. Okay. What was my second question?
Anti-Semitism to phlosem.
Right. How is it that the Christians shifted from anti-Semitism to philo-Semitism? Okay. So now here I need to get into a bit of a discussion of, anti-Semitism itself. All right. And where I want to start is a couple of things. First, when we talk about the concept of the Semite, if you remember from the conference, for those who were there, we took a certain journey through certain verses, certain biblical verses, talking about Nuh alayhi salam. And their understanding, if you remember, that there was and of course we don't ascribe to this. We don't say this about Nuh alayhi salam. He's free from all of that, but that he was a person who had planted a vineyard, and he got wine from there. He drank the wine. He was drunk in his tent, and he was passed out, and he was naked. This is their one of the narrations. And if you recall that particular narration, you had one of his sons, Ham, who walks in and sees him, and then comes out. And then his other two sons go in, they see him, and they walk in backwards, and they cover him. And when he wakes up from his stupor, he basically curses Ham and the descendants of Ham, meaning Canaan. They're all cursed. And he says that the chosen people are, that people would eventually become Semites. Okay? Now the issue that arises, one question that arises, is that a Semitic person is defined as someone that's from the seed of Abraham. And if you remember, Abraham had two sons. Even Islamically, we know this, right? Who were the two sons of Abraham? Ismail and Ishaq, or Ishmael and Isaac, right? Who came first? Ismail, right? Who said Ishaq? Okay. Okay, we're not getting the ikhtilaf here. Okay. The jamhur, yeah, okay. So, by majority, we're going to say Ismail alayhi salam. And also, according to the biblical narrative, it was also Ishmael or Ismail. Now, one of the aspects of this is that why would he not be considered a Semite? Or rather, why is his backdrop as a Semite downplayed? Well, one of the reasons is because who was his mother? Hajar, right? And Hajar comes from the lineage of Canaan. And Canaan was the children or the descendants of Ham. Ham was the one that was cursed. So therefore, he's excluded by way of his mother. Okay? So now Isaac and the son and the children of Ishaq or Isaac are the ones that are now considered Semitic. This concept of Semitism, however, is going to have certain problems when we explore who is a Jew and what is Judaism. But we'll get there when we get there. Okay. So the concept of anti-Semitism, can that be equated to a criticism of Israel? Let me just ask the question outright. Based on what I've said, how about that? So how many people think that equating of anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism is valid? Okay, we think it's not valid. Okay, other people have suspended judgment because they think I'm about to throw something at them, right? All right, so raise your hands again. Who thinks it's... All right, so not valid. Yes, why do you think it's not valid?
Because there's a lot of reasons that go through which talk equate
Okay, very good. So there's a group of Jews that don't subscribe to Zionism. All right, anything else? That's a good response. Yes.
Zionism is purely political ideology. There's nothing religious about it. They may use the religious flag, but it's purely political. They said they needed a land for their people, and in this case, the Jewish people. So it's purely political, nothing religious about Zionism.
There's nothing religious about Zionism. Okay, so if you asked a supporter of Zionism who is a Jew, would he agree with you?
He will not agree.
He will not agree with you. Okay, all right. We'll park that for a second. Yeah, back there.
Oh, I'd also like to add a massive chunk of Israel's population are atheists. I don't know how you could claim that God gave you land when you don't believe in God in the first place, but
Okay.
the contradictions here. It's like it is very easy to detach Zionism from Judaism because they were never connected in the first place. You know?
Okay, all right. So the fact that there is certain atheists who are also Zionists, connecting the two would be kind of difficult, etc.
The father of Zionism, Beer Herzl himself.
Peter Herzl himself was an atheist, correct? Yeah.
Isn't like a big portion of them, like they're not originally from that area, they're like Polish or...
Ah, so now you're talking about DNA testing. Fair enough. That's a hard case to make, but all right, if you're gonna tackle that. Anyone else? Anyone from the sisters? Well, I mean, I'll your perspective. You're gonna argue against it.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
That's why I asked who's supporting it, who's against it, who's for it.
I thought
Right.
you were talking about like their perspective. Or the Jewish perspective.
Sure.
Okay, okay.
Okay. Let's dive into this just for a few minutes, okay? Someone mentioned that it has a political backdrop, and that's basically, that's where it comes from. And to some extent, that has that's true, but what I'd like to do is explore it in a way where your interlocutor can't give you a response, all right? And this now comes to, how do we understand the Jewish position before Zionism, before the concept of Zionism even arose, all right? Now, we'll explore Zionism in a little bit, but let's now understand that Zionism is not cross-cultural and trans-historic. What do I mean? Meaning, it has not existed since the beginning, and it is not across every single Jewish culture, as was mentioned earlier, right? Now, that being the case, when you see Zionism coming up, one of the reasons why, in fact, one of the groups that brought Zionism to the fore were in fact not Jews. They were Protestant Christians. And we discussed this at the conference, and we'll explore this in a little bit. They were Protestant Christians. And based on their worldview, they had an understanding that until and unless the Jews are taken and implanted and placed back into the Holy Land, only then can the end time events start. And we'll explore that in a little bit, okay? Now, this idea comes from a Christian backdrop, right? And like I said, and specifically a Protestant Christian backdrop, which we'll explore. But for now, we want to now look at what or how much support was there from the Jewish population. In other words, when this concept arises, and before the creation of the state of Israel, you have the concept that's, this being circulated, Jews of Europe are being encouraged to come, and Jews across other parts of the world. By and large, the majority of Jews were against the concept of going back into Israel, or what's known as the restoration, to be restored back into Israel. And I didn't want to leave you empty. Let me give you the evidence here. So there's a quote from Michael Stanisławski. He says that the rabbis had long opposed apocalyptic speculation. Jews were forbidden to advance the end or even calculate it. The Messiah would be chosen by God in God's good time, and any activism among human beings to intervene in this process was a heresy to be condemned and punished. Now, he's not just saying this in a vacuum, because as you may know about Jewish texts, they have a certain group, they have a certain text which is called the Tanukh, which consists of the Torah, right, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. You have the Nabaviyin, which is the stories of the prophets. And you have the other rulings or something like that. The Katibin, the books, Jazakallah khair, which is the equivalent of saying Nabaviyin is like the Nabiyun, right? And the Katibin are the Kutub, right? The books, right? That's the Tanuh. That's the, okay? Then you have the Talmud, and the Talmud has two versions as well. Okay, there's what's known as the Babylonian Talmud, and you have the Jerusalem Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud is the one that is focused upon, all right? And there's reasons why that's the case. Because with the Jerusalem Talmud, there was a lot of restrictions at the time when it was being composed. In other words, because they were under a Christian rulership or a loosely Christian rulership, they weren't able to write freely. Whereas the Babylonian Talmud, they were under a different rulership, non-Christian, and they could write freely. And that's why in the Babylonian Talmud, the greatest kind of ad hominem attacks against Jesus are found in the Babylonian Talmud. I mean, the stuff that I can't even repeat that they say. And when everyone understand what I mean by ad hominem? It's just like attacking his character, his looks, his mother, she was X, Y, and Z, and so on. That's found in the Babylonian Talmud. Okay, so the Babylonian Talmud, it has, and the Talmud, just one more element to this, to make us, for the Muslims here, it's like a compilation of fiqh, like fiqh books. So if you studied Hanbali fiqh or Hanafi fiqh or whatever it is, there's books that compose of rulings, questions, and then rulings, okay? So in the Talmud, you find that there are three what are known as abjurations. And these abjurations are related to a verse in the Bible called the Song of Songs. And there are two tasks that are given to the Jews, okay? So now, what is going on here? They're basically taking a verse of the Bible, doing a tafsir of it, okay? An exegesis, an explanation of extracting the ruling from these verses. And there are two that are given. The first forbade Jews to enter Etz Israel as a wall, en masse. So the terminology is used as a wall, but what that means is as an entire community, en masse. So whereas you could enter as individuals or as families, but as an entire community, this is forbidden, according to the Babylonian Talmud. The second forbade them from rebelling against the nations in which they were dispersed. In other words, they couldn't revolt. And there's a backdrop to this as well. Because when you look at the formation of the temples, they had a temple that was built, the temple of Solomon, Sulaiman alayhi salam. That was destroyed, Nebuchadnezzar, 586 or something like this. And then another temple that was built in 70 of the current era, that gets destroyed by the Roman general Titus. So, and there's a series of revolts that they do. Every time they revolt against the government, they're suppressed and they're kicked out, okay? And by the way, when they were kicked out, where would they go once Islam arises? To the Muslim lands, right? So every time this happens, you would find them that, okay, for instance, when Umar ibn Khattab, when he opens up Bayt al-Maqdis, and you find that there are no Jews that are allowed to be there. In fact, the area or the Temple of Solomon, the Christians had done, they had taken all of their trash, all of their rubbish, and littered the entire area, the entire Temple of Solomon, right? And when Umar ibn Khattab comes in, you know, he sees this. He actually asked the bishop, show me where it is. The bishop was very shy, but eventually he tells him. And when Umar ibn Khattab, radiallahu anhu, when he walks in, he sees it. He takes off his upper garment and starts to clean the area himself, right? Because this was the place of Sulaiman alayhi salam, Dawood alayhi salam, and so on. When the Sahaba see this, they take off their upper garments, they start cleaning the area as well. And then, of course, he tells Bilal, he says, oh Bilal, qum fa'adhin, get up and make the adhan. So if you know from the Sirah, Bilal had stopped giving the adhan after the Prophet ﷺ had died. This is the first time he's now giving it. And when he gives it, the Sahaba are in tears because this is the first time after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. And they remember the days of the Prophet ﷺ, spending time with him and so on. But what I'm trying to say now, coming back to what I was saying, when Umar ibn Khattab, when he opens up Jerusalem, now he has the Jews come back to the city. They were banned from it. When you have the Crusaders come into Jerusalem, they also kick out the Jews as well. And it's only until Salahuddin al-Ayyubi comes in, calls them back in again. Similarly with Muslim Spain, it was similar, all right? When King Roderick of Spain, when he was oppressing a certain group of Christians, he sent the oppressed Christians who were non-Aryan Christians, they sent word to North Africa. Non-Aryan Christians and Jews that were living in Spain. And they sent a word to North Africa. The governor there, Musa bin Nusayr, he assembles an army, goes in and takes over Spain, right? The Jews are able to flourish. This is where the famous Maimonides writes his tracts on philosophical theology that till today are referred to by many of the Jews that study philosophical theology, right? And so you have this golden age. Once Spain is overtaken in 1492, it falls. Again, the Jews are told to leave, to be kicked out. And where do they go? They go to the Ottoman Empire, right? So again, this idea, coming back of where I was going with this, was the Babylonian Talmud. It talks about this en masse going in. They had constantly, whenever they revolted, they would be suppressed and kicked out. So based on that, their ruling was, we do not go back to the Holy Land en masse. If we have the opportunity, we go singly, but en masse. Now, this was rabbinic Judaism. This is what was taught across the world. This was the majority position, okay? And the only thing, and so that second abjuration was a type of passive resistance, because the idea is, just like the Muslims are awaiting the return of the Messiah, right? Isa alayhi salam. Just like the Christians are waiting for the return of the Messiah or the Messiah, the Jews are also waiting for the Messiah. This Messiah, according to them, when he comes back, he will then rule over the Holy Land, and he will bring a time of peace or whatever have you. Now, the idea was that based on these two rulings out of the biblical Talmud, there will be only a passive resistance, and we passively, patiently wait for the Messiah. And when he comes back, then we can actually do something. But until then, we are forbidden, or they were forbidden from acting. Okay, now let's come back to Zionism and Semitism. All right, so with this backdrop, now how do we now approach the issue? Anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, are they equal? What is your assessment at this point?
Yeah. So you're asking, can criticism of Israel be equated with anti-Semitism? And we've established that the restoration of Israel is not a Semitic concept.
Perfect. That was excellent. All right. Hopefully everyone heard that. Okay. So anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are things you can't equate. Where does the concept of Zionism arise? I mentioned that it arose from a Christian backdrop. And like I said, we'll get into a little bit of that. But what you'll notice is that the people at that time, when you have Zionism and the proponents of Zionism being Protestant Christians, and specifically Calvinists. Does anyone remember what a Calvinist is? For the people that are at the... One of the Protestant groups. There's too many. All right, so just as a refresher, Calvinists, they have the concept of that... Yeah, go ahead. You want to answer that? The elect, correct. In other words, they had this belief of predestination, that God will choose who will go to paradise, who will go to heaven, who will go to hell. And that is only by the election of God. So the concept of free will, or a human being having agency, is removed. In other words, you don't choose, God chooses. This concept of being the elect, we're going to see that it actually arises in Britain itself, and Britain seeing itself as the elect country to support the return of the Jews, based on a Calvinist backdrop, which also affects the eventual United States. Okay, but coming back to what I was mentioning. So, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism. So we said that Zionism has a Protestant backdrop. It's being pushed. What else is going on at this time in Europe? What you have is a strong concept of the nation state that is now coming up. In other words, that nations should be now divided by way of some sort of ethnic relationship. And so this is why, you know, I sometimes say that when it comes to the British, they are the ones that caused a lot of trouble everywhere they go, okay? So even currently with the situation in India and Pakistan, a lot of that has been left there as a gift by the British, right? Here's Kashmir, good luck, all right? So similarly, everywhere they go, they leave these gifts, okay? And they take their own gifts, right? So they took the Kohinoor diamond. Anyone know what that is? Right? They say it's the world's largest diamond, right? It's sitting in the British Museum at the moment, if you want to see it. Anyway, so what were some of the concepts that they bring? They bring forth a concept of nationalism. There's this idea of nationalism. The British, they give, you can say, 3 promises at the same time. Okay, so this is like pre-World War I. The 3 promises are, number 1, they had a promise or a deal with the French, known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. All right, the Sykes-Picot Agreement was a agreement with the French to say all of the lands of the Ottomans. So these three agreements were to how do we deal with the Ottoman territory that we're going to take over. So one agreement was this one with the French. We'll divide it up and we'll divide them into nations, and you take some and we'll take some, because we are the future superpowers. That was one of them. The second agreement happened with some of the Arabs, and this was known as the McMahon-Hussein Agreement or correspondence. And this was something where the Arabs were promised, look, when we take over the Ottoman Empire, you can take over leadership. This was the second promise. The third promise was the establishment of the Jewish nation. In other words, to the Jews, that we will establish Israel under the Balfour Declaration. Okay? In this environment of this the nationalism, this is where you have as our brother mentioned, Theodor Herzl and other who start to come towards the Zionist narrative from the Jewish sector. They start to see this as a concept of bringing a national homeland to the Jews, not based, like you said, on some sort of religious backdrop, because the majority, like I mentioned, was religiously against all of this. Okay? So, with that said, once you have these agreements in place, Rabbinic Judaism is completely against this. And so this concept of pure nation states was what influences the Zionists, the Zionist cause, and more Jews are now jumping on the bandwagon. Why? Why is this becoming more and more attractive? What's going on? Life is getting hard in Europe. All right? Sorry? Well, the Holocaust is to come later, but even before the Holocaust, Jews are not given equal rights. Okay? In fact, even in Britain itself, the people that wanted to now take the Jews and give them, and elevate the Jews and have this type of phlosemitism, even there, they were not given equal rights. So what exactly was the logic behind the state of Israel? How do you get there? How do you put the Christians, or how do you put the Jews back there? So there was something known as the Jew law that was fought for in Britain. Now, this particular law, it had some background to it. In other words, they wanted to extend full civil rights to Jews at full civil rights. Why? Because of Jewish disabilities, is what they called it. What is the Jewish disability? It's not being full citizens in the country that they're in, meaning in Britain itself. Now, there's a problem here. The problem is because, remember, we said that there's a Calvinist backdrop. They consider themselves the elect, and if Britain is the elect of God, if they favor the Jews, they take away their Christian identity, meaning that they've now favored one community over and above their Christian identity. Okay? The reason why this is important is because there's a big evangelical movement preceding this to evangelize, to call the Jews to Christianity. So if if that's front and center, your identity is defined by your Christianity. To now give Jews equal rights is to take away your Christianness as a dominant backdrop and a dominant worldview. So this is one leg or one problem. The second problem, however, is that you still had Zionists, you still had people, again, from the Protestant sector, saying that there should be a return of the Jews to Palestine, or a return or the restoration. And because of that, we should give them full rights. Does everyone understand the tension that's going on here? There's one of identity and one of elevating or philo-Semitism. Is that clear, the tension? Yes? I want to make sure I'm not losing people. Okay. So I'm gonna quote something here. The extension of full civil rights to the Jews at the cost of renunciation of Britain's identity as a Christian nation. All right? It was the great stumbling blocks that Christians had placed in their way of their own inconsistencies. The position is rooted in the notion that there's a permanent distinction among nations, one that is not dissolved by conversion. All right. What was the third question I asked? Who is a Jew? What is Judaism? All right. What I want us to do is at this juncture to think about this question. Because when we want to define who is a Jew and what is Judaism, do we define it by way of a bloodline or do we define it by way of practice? In other words, can someone be a Jew just by practicing the Mosaic law? That's the question at heart here, all right? If the answer is yes, then it's not limited to a bloodline. It's not limited to ethnicity. And if it's ethnicity, then the concept of following the Mosaic law is completely irrelevant, and you can have atheists become Jews. Do you see how the question becomes very important? Who is a Jew and what is Judaism? All right? Let's explore this question a little bit further, bi'idhnillah. So, the first thing we want to now go back to is that this question was something even if you remember when I talked about Paul and Peter. Remember, when Paul comes and tells Peter, he says, look, we're going to extend this faith to the Gentiles. What was Peter's response? Was he gung-ho about it? He said, yes, that's great. He said, no. Now, here's the question. If it's true, let's assume for a minute that Peter was one of the Hawariyun, that he was one of the apostles of Jesus. Do we expect that an apostle or a companion of a prophet would say, we do not want guidance for anyone? Do we expect that? I don't think so, right? And if you're looking for evidence, a clear evidence would be that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells Musa alayhi salam, right? Idhab ila Fir'aun. Go to Fir'aun, go to Pharaoh. Now, Pharaoh is not from Bani Israel. And he tells him, call him, invite him, right? So that he may be purified. So in other words, when a prophet comes, he may be sent to a particular nation, but he's not limited to that nation. He's sent to a nation because of a similar language, backdrop, law, whatever it may be, but he's not locked to that nation, meaning it's not necessarily racial or ethnic. This is something really important for us to understand. So therefore, if you look at the case that Peter's making, when he's saying, when he is uncomfortable taking the faith to the Gentiles, that discomfort doesn't come from the fact that Gentiles are not Jewish by their blood or their nationality. It comes by way of the fact that he wants to eschew or do away with Mosaic law. And all of this revolves around the question of circumcision. In other words, when Paul is coming to Gentiles and telling them, look, you should be Christian and you should follow the Mosaic law, and one of the dictates of Mosaic law is that you get circumcised, how is that a good selling point? It's not, because in those days, you don't go to the hospital and get, under anesthesia and wake up and have a little bit of recovery time and you're good to go. That's not how circumcision works. Now, this concept of circumcision itself becomes central to the division between Paul and Peter, because it is an indication of who are the true followers of Jesus, and by extension Moses, and who are not, according to Peter. Paul basically says that's irrelevant. By the way, is this concept prevalent within the Muslims? of circumcision? Well, first of all, for men, obviously it is, as a way of law. But it's interesting that when we speak about the fitrah, which I spoke about earlier, about the original normative disposition, about the original normative state, there are certain physical acts that represent or reflect the fitrah itself. The Prophet ﷺ has mentioned many, right? The cutting of the nails, etc., and cleaning yourself. And one of those is circumcision. In fact, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that, when he talks about the fitrah itself, this concept in many of the tafsirs and many of the exegesis of the Quran, they tie it to circumcision. When Allah says, Sibghat Allah, wa man ahsanu min Allahi sibgha, wa nahnu lahu abidun, right? In the sibgha of Allah, the dye, D-Y-E, the coloring of Allah. Who is better at coloring, dyeing, than Allah? And indeed, we are the ones who worship. Notice Allah says, abidun, ubad, the concept of submitting yourself, right? If you've been asked to circumcise, you submit. Sami'na wa ta'na, okay? So now, when you go, you'll find that commentators, for instance, Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah, rahimahullah ta'ala, when he talks about circumcision, he says that no doubt there's a concept of cleanliness and purity and so on, but also this is like a type of branding. What do I mean? Like in the olden days, or maybe even today, certain Texas ranches, you would take certain animals and brand them, like a hot iron. Now, why is branding done? Why is that what's the purpose of that? Qualify the animal, ownership. Who owns this animal? So Ibn al-Qayyim says, just like that, it is a type of branding that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does. In other words, circumcision to indicate who are the people of Allah and who are others. Who are the people that follow the Prophet, whatever Prophet they're sent to, and who are the others, right? So this concept of circumcision, it is part and parcel of the Islamic worldview. It is part and parcel of the Judaic worldview as well. It is absent, by and large, from the Christian worldview. And I'm saying by and large because there are always exceptions, okay? So now, when it comes to defining who or what is a Jew, one of the central questions arises, is it limited to race, or does it extend beyond race, and is it limited, or does it go to the obedience? And so what we see is, from a Judaic perspective, before Zionism gets introduced, like I just said, it was about obedience. It was about, do you obey the Talmud, the Torah, and do you submit to it, okay? The centrality of being racial only comes with the concept of nation states, all right? Now, I wanted to just quote something from Paul here, because one of these statements, he actually expounds upon this very clearly. He says, and by the way, just to kind of summarize, a Jew is defined, and this is, and I'll mention who said it. A Jew was defined. To the Jews, the answer was self-sufficient. A Jew was defined by faith and ethnicity and the association with the Jewish community. Judaism was defined largely by adherence to the rabbinic tradition and its devotion to the Old Testament and the Talmud. That's the Jewish position in the Middle Ages. For Christians, their tradition insisted that the Jews were the new people of God, the true Jews by faith in the Jewish Messiah. So notice, even their definitions are different from this perspective. Okay, so we spoke about the concept of branding. We spoke about circumcision. And if I can find it, I had a quote here. Actually, I'll just leave that for now, and I'll come back to it later. Okay. So, the process of the Jews returning, and how did that evolve? In other words, how did that change? Because we said for 1800 years, there was a deep animosity between Jews and Christians. And so if you were at the conference, we went into some details about this. We talked about some of the Talmudic passages which speak about Isa alayhi salam in very, very filthy ways, right? So we talked about the ruling on getting a tattoo on Yom Sabt, on the day of Sabbath, if you remember. And if you could do more than 2 letters as a tattoo, and the way they ruled against that, they say, because that man, referring to Jesus, he did that, therefore it is haram for us to do, okay? Anyway, so they had their legalistic framing and what have you. But the point is, you have this historic animosity between Christians and Jews. It's the reason why we said that the Jews ran to Muslim lands and so on. What changes? So what changes is the advent of the Protestant movement itself. And you remember, Martin Luther now comes, and Martin Luther has 95 theses that he nails to the church. Martin Luther has a connection with the Muslim world. So again, recall that a lot of the ideas that he's influenced by are coming from Muslim lands. For instance, we talked about the concept of sola scriptura. Someone remind me, what is that? Not you guys. What is sola scriptura?
Scripture only?
Sorry?
Is it scripture only?
Scripture only. So solo, scripture only. Okay. All right. So the concept of sola scriptura. In other words, that before Martin Luther, the text of the Bible was not translated into the vernacular. It wasn't translated into the common languages that people spoke, German and English and so on. It was quarantined to the church in Latin and perhaps, let's say, Hebrew and by extension Greek, which if you had theological training, you would learn it, but the laity, the general people, had no exposure to the Bible directly. How did they know their faith? By church practices, by traditions, by sermons, and so on. Now when Martin Luther comes, he translates much of the Bible or all of the Bible, and he has one other boost, one other thing that takes his message and has it catch fire, spread far and wide. What was that? The printing press. This is where you have the Gutenberg printing press, and because now he can print these, he can spread it far and wide. Okay, this particular element, it leads to a certain problem. Now, what is this problem? The problem is when it comes to understanding the Bible, when it comes to interpreting the Bible, before Martin Luther, there were 4 ways you could interpret the Bible. In other words, 4 tools, what we could call hermeneutics or hermeneutical tools that you could use. All right? Those 4 tools were what we call the tradition itself, the church fathers, apostolic succession, and of course the Bible, the text of the Bible itself. So these are 4 tools by which you do a tafsir, an exegesis of the Bible. Now, I want to preface this by a few things, and I'm going to compare this to the Islamic framework just for a second, just for us. If you've studied usul tafsir, when it comes to understanding or interpreting the Quran, do we have a distinct method in which we do that? Yes or no? There is. Now, that distinct method, where does it come from? Now I'm testing your Islamic knowledge. Let's see how good you guys are in terms of your other backdrop. Where is it? Let me make it very clear. The usul of tafsir, where's your primary source for those? The Quran itself. In other words, they're native and indigenous to the Quran itself. So the principle, for instance, of having a tafsir or an exegesis or an explanation of a verse, and that parts of the Quran, you understand them by other parts of the Quran, right? This concept comes from a certain verse where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَفَلَا تَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ. Do they not reflect upon the Quran? وَلَوْ كَانَ مِنْ عِنْدِ غَيْرِ اللَّهِ لِوَجَدُوا فِيهِ اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا. Do they not ponder upon the Quran? Had they found in it, did not ponder upon the Quran, had it been from any other than Allah, they would have found in it many contradictions. Now, many of the du'at love using this verse, right? Find a contradiction. But this is a verse that gives the evidence for the fact that if you have an understanding of a verse of the Quran and it contradicts another understanding, that understanding is wrong. So you can say the verse means this, this, and this, and it means this and this. Only the ones that reconcile are the ones you can take. Why? Because there's no contradictions, right? I'll give you a simple example, like overly simplified, all right? It's a hypothetical. Imagine now that a Christian comes to you and they say, look, man, your Quran, it has the Trinity. And I can prove it. You're like, okay, what's going on, man? How are you gonna prove the Trinity from the Quran? Say, look, most chapters start with Bismillah, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. Right? So 3 in one. See, your Quran has it. Okay. Now that is one interpretation. Okay? That's one interpretation. But then you have other ayat that are crystal clear that say what? Qul huwallahu ahad, right? Say Allah is one and uniquely one, right? Ilahukum ilahun wahid. Your God is only one God. Now, you have one interpretation would say that Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim are three attributes of God, and that God is one but has many attributes. Or you have the interpretation that our Christian friend, hypothetical Christian friend, brings and says that there's three gods. The hermeneutical principle that you apply is that if you have an interpretation that is contradictory, you put it on the side. Okay? It's just an example of the fact that our tafsir, our hermeneutics, when it comes to understanding the Quran, is first and foremost indigenous to the Quran itself. Allah Himself teaches the Muslims how to interpret the Quran. That's number one. Of course, then there's other means. Allah says, Atiyu Allah wa atiyu Rasul, obey Allah and obey the Messenger. Therefore, what the Prophet ﷺ has said, we take that as interpretation, the Arabic language. This is not a class on Usul Tafsir, so I can't keep going. But you get the idea, okay? It's indigenous to the Quran. When it comes to the interpretation of the Bible, remember we said it has four kind of sources of understanding of interpretation prior to Martin Luther. We said number one was apostolic succession. What do we mean by that? When we talk about apostolic succession, this is a chain that is supposed to go back to the church and supposed to go back to the Hawariyun, the apostles. And this is represented by the Pope himself, meaning this sanad, this chain of narrators, or not narrators, but this chain goes back to the companions or the apostles of Jesus. So if they have a certain understanding, then we will take that understanding. Okay? That's apostolic succession. The representative of that understanding is none other than the Pope. Okay? So the Pope is the one that exemplifies that, tells you I have apostolic succession. If I say that this is haram, this is haram. If I say this is halal, this is halal. Halas, right? Number two, the traditions of the church. So many traditions over time had come from many monks and pious people within the church itself. And those were taken very seriously. These are people that, because of their piety, their interpretation was taken seriously, and it started to form certain traditions. For instance, some of those traditions were the intercession of certain saints, a type of idolatry according to Protestants. But this tradition was part and parcel of how the Bible was interpreted in tradition. So this is number two. Number three, the people within the church. We said that they were equipped. They had a theological knowledge. They knew Latin. They knew Greek, Hebrew. They had been trained in the church in terms of exegesis and how to interpret. And so church fathers had something to say. And of course, the Bible itself. When it comes to Martin Luther, we look at apostolic succession. Apostolic succession means the Pope. But Luther had said that the Pope, his interpretation of that was that he was the Antichrist. He was Masih Dajjal, okay? Why did he say that? Well, because when he nailed his 95 Theses to the doors of his church, he was excommunicated. But it wasn't just that he was excommunicated from the church itself. It was also that at certain times, him and his family were under physical threat from the Catholics that surrounded him. So from that vantage point, he had what he interpreted, his interpretation of the Bible, because he's directly looking at it, was that the Pope, because of the evil that it wrought, right? One of those evils was something known as indulgences. You could sign your contract, you could sign away a ticket to paradise. The Pope could do that for you. The church could do that. So this was something that was corrupt. This is something that he worked against. And other corruptions. So because of those corruptions, because of how the Pope had excommunicated him, how his family was in danger, he basically says the Pope is the Antichrist. By the way, there's another major enemy, major Satan, that Luther highlights. Anyone want to guess who that is? The Muslims. Very good. Why? Because at this point, you have the Ottoman Empire that's knocking on the doors of Europe, right? And you have this Muslim threat. And so now interpreting who are these Muslims, the interpretation that was given that they were a Satan that had come to undo the kingdom of Christ. In one interpretation. Another interpretation was that it was the Antichrist. There was another interpretation as well. So these two concepts of the Pope being vilified and Islam being vilified, Luther had both of them. Now, by the way, another kind of tidbit that I mentioned at the conference, but for those who weren't there, it's interesting. I said that Luther had a lot of influences from the Muslim world. And we said that one of those influences was sola scriptura, which I just mentioned, the Bible alone. Why? Because in observing how the Muslims interact with the Quran, their interaction is direct, right? Remember, the Prophet ﷺ says, خَيْرُكُمْ مَنْ تَعَلَّمَ الْقُرْآنَ وَعَلَّمَهُ. The best of you is the one who learns the Quran and then teaches it. Direct, right? Of course, the Arabic language, everyone learns it, is encouraged to learn it, and so on and so forth. So this is one observation. Another observation is the idea that Muslims, when they worship, they don't go through saints or statues or idols. When they ask Allah alone. So now this is another concept. That saint worship that he's observing, that's problematic. So he says that's wrong. And anyway, so there's other aspects. So number one, in terms of interpreting the Bible, if the Pope is the Antichrist, there's no apostolic succession. So you can't use that as a hermeneutical tool, as a asl in tafsir. Okay? What about tradition? Well, that tradition, remember we said it's paganism. Why? Because these saints that you're having intercede between you and God, this is paganism. And remember, we said that there's an influence here from Islam and the Muslims that he's interacting with. And the thing that I wanted to mention, one of the first translations of the Quran that was printed was done at the behest of Martin Luther. One of the first translations. It wasn't a very good translation, but it was one of the first. So he used the printing press, not because he had sympathy towards the Muslims. He wanted the Quran or the translation of the Quran to be printed so that it could be shown that it is an evil text and this man, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is the evil man, na'udhu billah, right? Anyway, so tradition is paganism. So you can't use tradition in interpreting the Bible. What about the church fathers? Well, because they had now started this protest against them, the church fathers didn't help them, and so because they was excommunicated, they also are irrelevant. You're only left with the text of the Bible itself. Why is this important? Because now when someone comes to the Bible, their only tool is themselves, their own individual interpretation. We started off by saying that the backdrop has always been apocalyptic, right? That apocalyptic backdrop, that the return of Jesus, now, because it's in the common vernacular, every person can interpret it with this backdrop to say it's right around the corner, and so now we start presenting our own interpretations. And this leads to a certain problem. One of the reasons we were talking about denominations, you said there's too many of them, right? There's too many of them because if every person can interpret the Bible however they want, you can make a denomination, right? And so you have Calvinists and Methodists and Baptists and so on because of the hermeneutical kind of loosening up and focusing solely on the Bible itself, okay? Now, this particular, let me stop here for a second. Any questions? I don't want to just keep going a million miles an hour. Any questions so far? No questions? It was either very clear or...
Something.
Okay, go for it.
Reconcile the idea of Peter wasn't a big fan of inviting the Gentiles, even though he was disagreeing with Paul in regards to the circumcision.
So there's passages in the Bible that indicate that he finally came around.
Here, then?
Yeah. Oh, there's some passages that indicate that. Now, Allahu A'lam, again, because we don't testify to the veracity of the biblical narrations. If they reconcile with the Quran, we accept it. If they don't, we don't. So Allahu A'lam, if Peter was really one of the Hawariyun, it would seem unlikely, right? And Allah knows best. Yes.
So this not super like the Injil or why?
Yeah.
Like amongst the Christians, one of the interactions is that why isn't there a desire for them to say, what is that original text as it was revealed to Isa alayhi salam? Why did that desire, what movement or what concept in history kind of push that away, and then they're just okay with the King James version or the Reader's Digest version or the Salt Lake version, whatever it is.
Okay, were you at the conference?
I was at the conference.
You're at the
yes.
conference. All right. So do you, actually, let me get someone else to answer that who was also at the conference. You want to give it a shot? Okay. So your question again, why is it that the idea of the Bible being authentic or whatever, what have you, like why was that done away with? Is that essentially what you're asking?
Why is it that
Why is that not important? Like if someone comes to you and says, well, the Quran's not authentic, then you'd be very offended. Like, how dare you say that, right? So why is that not important? Does anyone remember? Because we talked about this when we talked about the evangelical movement, especially in America.
It was like after the debate on evolution. I think being taught in schools, there was like a bigger focus on rationality, and then some Christian schools like isolated themselves to study more about Christianity, and then some Christians just focused solely on like the preaching part.
Exactly. So when you look at the evangelical movement, and this is specifically like an Amerocentric understanding of why they're able to, what we say, inoculate themselves against this idea of you have to give rational evidence and proof that the Bible is true, is because we said that when those movements came from Europe, all right, one of those was evolution, and we spoke about in detail, if you recall, that there was a whole trial based on fighting evolution and so on and so forth. But another idea that came from Europe, from the Tübingen school, was what we call the historical critical method. The historical critical method basically dictates that any sort of interpretation or any sort of accepting of the Bible has to be rooted in history, has to have some sort of historical backdrop. So therefore, if you're going to say that this, this chapter of the Bible is truly what it says it is, what is the historicity of it? So based on that, there was a rejection of many parts of the Bible. There was a rejection of miracles, because as a historian, you are always playing a game of probability, meaning that if something in history, you're always going to look at what is the most likely thing to happen. That's how you do history, by and large, especially in Western academia. Now, one of the problems with miracles is that by its logic, a miracle is the least likely thing to happen, naturally. So therefore, the concept of miracles is now taken out if you follow the historical critical method. This historical critical method, when it comes to the United States, how fundamentalists, as they were called at the time, how they inoculated themselves was they started to get into this type of isolationism. And so they said, we're not going to teach historical critical method. We're not going to teach evolution. We had certain schools, the Bob Jones University, we spoke about that. And so there was a type of isolation. And what they did was that instead of focusing on the technical, kind of logical, cerebral, clinical analysis of the Bible and about theology and things like that, they started focusing on experiences. And this is part of the Great Awakening, the first and second Great Awakening, where they would have people that go around communities and tell stories, right? So now if you have someone that's coming with logic and historical textual criticism, and he's now telling you something, and you have a person in a crowd who comes up and says, you know what, I was an alcoholic, and my, and my wife was about to leave me, and she's going to take my children, but the Lord saved me. Jesus saved me. And now I'm here, and his wife is in the backdrop, she's crying, the children are there, and it's a success story. Now, with that backdrop, and this is going around, with that backdrop, if you come to this person, he has an experiential, emotive reality. It doesn't matter what your technical, logical, his textual criticism is going to bring. Because they look, it transformed a person's life. Who cares about your logic? So that's how, by and large, that's inoculated. Okay? And that also is existent today as well. We give examples of this. Sorry?
Oh, sorry. So I was saying, like, in the beginning, you were talking about like Greg Abbott and all these, like, I don't know if you're getting to that part, but like, could you maybe elaborate on in terms of like modern times, right? Why is it so critical and important for these, religious people for the existence of Israel? Because I think that's kind of like what's on the
That's at the heart of the matter.
Right. That's what's on everybody's mind.
Sure.
Because like Jews and Christians are so much fundamentally different in terms of how they view Isa, Islam and stuff. And they don't necessarily agree with even the end of times, how it's going to play out.
Scenario, yeah.
So why is it so critical for them to have the state of Israel, and it's like, the hill they want to, basically plant their flag on, like to give us context in terms of what is the,
Okay. All right. We're going to get there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just working slowly, inshallah. So, yes. Anybody else? Up to what we've spoken about so far. But, yeah.
It's more of a question of history. So the Protestant reforms brought forward by Luther, right? That was like all of these events primarily took place in Europe, right? So I'm curious from like a global perspective, at that point in time, how was Christianity practiced like differently in like old like places like outside of Europe, like Ethiopia, for example, that had Christianity far before even Europe, or India, for example, or wherever it may be. Did like Lutheran reforms, did that impact how they live their lives in any way?
So that eventually, over time, impacts the rest of the world, because one of the kind of the Protestant movement has a backdrop in evangelicalism, right? In other words, to spread the good news. So now with the colonial project, that is part and parcel of it. So missionaries and societies, it goes to India, it goes to Africa. So the Protestant understanding of Christianity gets spread by way of the colonial project, absolutely. Now, if you're talking about prior to Martin Luther and his 95 Theses and things like that, the Christianity that was practiced in other parts of the world was different. You have Eastern Orthodox Christians, and their beliefs were different because of the Great Schism that we spoke about. It's an interesting study that I won't unpack right now, but when you start to look at the narratives in our Islamic sources, it's some interesting aspects. So for instance, when you go back to the Council of Nicaea at 325, and that there was this debate between Arian Christians, who by and large had a concept of Jesus not being God or divine, but being less than divine. And then you had the position that was finally adopted, which was the Nicene position. Athanasius was the person that fought for that. The Nicene position, or the position Athanasius came with, which was eventually became the Trinity, is what won out. But the Arian movement didn't just die off. It actually spread to different parts. If you remember, I had mentioned that the Muslims were called from King Roderick, King Roderick, when the Jews and the other Christians, sent a message to North Africa, to the Muslims there, King Roderick was Arian, and he was oppressing non-Arian Christians and Jews, okay? Where that has significance for us is that when scholars look at certain narrations, they assume, or they theorize, that some of the Christians that are being spoken about were of an Arian persuasion, okay? So for example, in the story of Salman al-Farisi, if you remember in that story, he specifically, when he narrates it, he says that the bishop that I went to, they would say, there's very few of us left. Now, this is a very particular statement because you're talking about the entire Byzantium Empire, right? So why would this bishop that he's visiting say there's very few of us left? So some Muslim scholars have theorized, I think Sheikh Ahmed al-Nadawi holds this opinion, and others, that because he was of an Arian persuasion, that's why he said that. And that's why when Salman comes, he doesn't come with a Trinitarian understanding of Jesus or Islam or the backdrop of that. He comes with a relatively close understanding, if not a full understanding, of Tawheed itself. Okay, good question. Let's do this. Let's do a 5-minute break, stand up, walk around, and we reconvene. I'll just mention this, the last section, just very quickly. We're going to come back to the question that was asked about, and that was the last point that I was actually making, was the conversion of anti-Semitism to philo-Semitism. How do we get to where we are today? That's kind of at the core of what we want to talk about. So we'll do that when we come back. So 5 minutes, and then we'll reconvene.
Good point to say.
Sure.
So if we look at the impact of the evangelical into trying to justify the Jewish way versus the Jewish influence to convince the evangelicals,
Yeah.
who would you weigh more?
The evangelicals, hands down. I'm gonna talk about that. But it starts with a Christian position. It doesn't start with the Jews. Majority of them were against it. All right, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulil Kareem. All right. We're going to take another half hour, 40 minutes, and then we want to wrap it up. All right? Give you some time for some Q&A, and it'll give me a little bit of a break too. Inshallah. So the place that I left off was, and there's a reason why I left off here, had to do with the hermeneutics of the Bible. If you have your own interpretation, and that comes from an apocalyptic backdrop, you start to now have interpretations on the Bible in various ways. You basically, in a sense, you take interpretations as you choose. Certain factions or certain groups, certain denominations, took the interpretation of the Bible, what we say, literally. And so many of the verses, when it comes to the Bible, they implemented it or they took it as in a literal sense. Okay, one of the key verses that is mentioned and was mentioned by Mike Huckabee was Genesis 12. So I wanted to just kind of repeat it here. Now Genesis 12, basically, it is a conversation of God with Abraham, and it states, "The Lord said to Abraham." Now, this is a promise that is being made by God to Abraham. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to a land I will show you." Here he's speaking about the Holy Land, right? Moving from Iraq, where he was, to Beit al-Maqdis and the surrounding area. He says, "I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be blessed. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you." This particular verse that, like I said, even Mike Huckabee mentioned, this is at the core of understanding why there is such a deep, intricate, impassioned support for the Jews, for the return of the Jews to the Holy Land. Why? Well, number one, because when Abraham is being spoken to, the people that are blessed, the seed of Abraham that's being blessed, that's interpreted as who? Isaac. And we already said that that is excluding Ishmael, right? And we said it's excluding Ishmael because he had certain roots that go back to Canaan, and he's excluded because of who his mother was, all right? And by the way, that was one reason. There's other reasons that were given. So, for instance, I think it was Billy Graham. He said that in his interpretation, just goes to show that you can, the interpretation is fast and loose. When talking about Ishmael and why Ishmael and his seed is not considered, in other words, the Arabs, he said that when Abraham, when he wanted to have a child, he wanted to accelerate God's plan. And God didn't like that. And how did he accelerate God's plan? By having Sarah let him have relations with her maidservant, Hajar, in other words. And so, because they made a deal that if you do this and you have a child, if she gives you a child, then you have a child. You'll have an heir. But, as Billy Graham says, but this was not what God wanted. And they tried to accelerate God's plan, and God did not want that. That's why the Arabs and the children of Ishmael are excluded from this promise. Again, how you interpret it, there's multiple different ways. That's how Billy Graham decided to do it, and others. Okay, so Genesis 12 forms the basis for this. There are certain interpretations that we want to now quantify and make it very simple. You have a certain movement that arises. This movement is what's known as the dispensationalist movement. The founder of this movement is someone by the name of John Nelson Darby. John Nelson Darby, prior to him, when you looked at the promises that were given in the Bible, they were looked at being interconnected. He's the first one, or initially, that says that rather they're not interconnected, but they're based on epochs of time. And so if you have a promise in one epoch, that is not something that excludes a promise in another epoch, all right? Another dispensation of time. So what happens is that they divide up the dispensations, or these periods in time, into seven time periods. John Nelson Darby, he has this understanding in the early 19th century that the Bible is to be understood in dispensations. There are 7 dispensations and 7 time periods. So the first dispensation is what's known as the age of innocence. This is before Adam, this is Adam before the fall, meaning before he ate from the tree, he was innocent. So this is age or first dispensation. Dispensation number 2 is the dispensation or the age of conscience. In other words, this is from Adam to Noah. Then you have the third, which is the dispensation of human government, from Noah to Abraham. You have the fourth, which is the promise, Genesis 12 that talks about it, Abraham to Moses. Okay? The fifth is the dispensation or epoch of the law, which is Moses to Jesus. And then you have the 6th dispensation, which is the church. The 6th dispensation is what we are in today, the age of the church. Okay? The 7th dispensation is what's known as the kingdom. And this kingdom, according to certain verses of the Bible, is stated to be 1,000 years long. Okay? This is what's known as the millennium. Now, the process in which the return of Jesus happens, according to this understanding, is that you have these 7 epochs of time. We're in the church age right now. So in this church age, what's coming is 1,000 years of peace and prosperity, the kingdom of God. Now, how you interpret that 1,000 years is going to dictate how you understand whether the Jews have a physical restoration or a spiritual restoration. Now, let me qualify this very quickly. It has always been understood that the Jews should have a type of restoration. It was generally, by and large, understood that that would be a spiritual restoration. In other words, that they would come to Christ. And so therefore, early evangelicals talked about a spiritual restoration, meaning that evangelical efforts should be focused on Jews more than other people. Because it's only when they convert and they are restored spiritually, then the millennium will start. Is that clear? Okay? That's what we call spiritual restoration. But spiritual restoration morphs into a physical restoration. In other words, it's not that they should be spiritually restored, but physically restored. And we'll get into how that happens in just a second. But for right now, the 7 dispensations, 1,000 years, so we have the church age that we're living in now. What's coming up next is 1,000 years. That's known as the millennium. The interpretation of that could be that either you could be an amillennialist, meaning that is just metaphoric. Before the Protestant movement, that's generally, by and large, what it was understood as. They were amillennialists. So early church fathers did not take this as a literal 1,000 years. That's number 1. Number 2, this church age that's going to come was not something that was going to come on this earth, but rather it's a kingdom that would be established on heavens. But that now morphs into a kingdom on earth itself. So this 1,000 years of peace and prosperity and comfort is ushered in by the physical return of the Jews, okay, in the dispensationalist understanding, the one that becomes dominant, all right? So just to recap, 7 dispensations, we're in the 6th, the church age. After the church age is the millennium, or the age of grace is what it's called. This 1,000-year period, there's 2 broad interpretations, or 3. I mentioned one, which is amillennialism. It's not really 1,000 years, it's just metaphoric. A second one is what's known as premillennialism. In other words, that Jesus will be sent before this 1,000 years. And then you have post-millennialism. Jesus comes after this 1,000 years. In both pre- and post-millennialism, it is that the 1,000 years is real. Now, how and when you interpret this, by and large, early Protestants were post-millennialists. They believed that Jesus would come after this time of peace and prosperity. So what would happen is Christianity would spread, peace would come upon the earth, and then Jesus would come. Okay? Premillennialists, which is what is part of our modern Christian Zionist movement, is that Jesus would come and then he would usher in 1,000 years of peace and prosperity. So everyone clear on this so far? Okay, I need to add another wrinkle into this. That before these 1,000 years, there will be 7 years of tribulation. So now you have, does Jesus come before the tribulation, after the tribulation, or in the middle of the tribulation? And you have categorizations of pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib. I know, it gets a bit, but the point is that for those who claim, so those have this backdrop in Christian Zionism, they basically say that the return of Jesus is pre-trib. 7 years of tribulation before the 1,000 years, Jesus will come before these tribulations, right? Now, why is that the case? Or rather, so let me rephrase that. Before these tribulations, there'll be something called the rapture. So I misspoke. Not that Jesus will come, that people will be taken up to the heavens. All of the practicing Christians, wherever they may be, wherever they may be, right? In whatever state they may be, they'll be lifted up. This is what's known as a rapture. This is pre-trib theology, okay? So I hope that's a bit clear. So let me just rephrase that. 7 years of tribulation, 1,000 years of peace and prosperity. Pre-tribulation, the rapture, okay? If you say that it's post-trib or mid-trib, those are people that say there's no dispensations, we don't believe in this rapture, okay? Certain Christians have that idea. Then you have the 1,000 years, the millennium. Does Jesus come at the beginning or at the end? Again, for those people that adopt Christian Zionism, he comes at the beginning. Now, with all of this said, pre-trib, pre-millennial, in order for that to happen, there has to be a physical restoration of the Jews to the Holy Land. It's not spiritual anymore. And that's based on certain verses in, I believe, Daniel, Ezekiel, and a few other verses, that they're taken to say it has to be physical. Why? Because there's a shift from saying that it's not about spiritually saving the Jews and having them being restored. It's about a physical restoration, and that when Jesus comes, if he comes and he is truly the Messiah, then the Jews will follow him anyway. Now, from the Jewish vantage point, if the Messiah comes and he's not Jesus, then the Christians will say, all right, well, we'll follow him. In other words, they hung in abeyance their interpretation of who the Messiah is until the end. All right? So let me just categorize this very briefly. 3 religions or 3 backdrops: Muslims, Christians, Jews. All of them believe in the coming of a Messiah at the end of times. 2 of them agree to the identity, that is Jesus, the son of Mary. Okay, the Christians and the Muslims. 1 does not. 2 of them agree that there will be an antichrist, a Messiah Dajjal, that Isa will fight, Jesus will fight. That would be the Muslims and the Christians. The Jews, they believe in a Messiah that's coming, and that this Messiah, remember, that he's going to come at the end of times, and that the Zionist project, now take a step back now, remember, initially the majority of rabbinic Jews, the majority of Jews said that there's no return to Palestine, there's no return to the Holy Land. That now changes by way of the Zionist push, by having an interpretation that, look, the 3rd temple, so there's 3 temples, 2 temples that were built. The 3rd temple, according to the Jews, is going to be built by the Messiah. The interpretation that 3rd temple, we're going to sit and wait, morphs over time by way of Zionist activity, and the Jews now, many of them say that 3rd temple will be built before the coming of the Messiah, from their interpretation. All right? Is everyone clear about this so far? So I've given a lot of information very quickly. Is it clear? Yes? So, there is a hand. Yes?
It's a very basic question.
Yeah.
If you can just explain what a Messiah is.
Okay. Well, yeah. Okay, so what do we mean by Messiah? A Messiah, right? So, from let's say a biblical vantage point, this is someone who's been anointed, chosen. In the Islamic vantage point, there's different interpretations of it, right? When you talk about Messiah comes from Masah, someone that's been anointed from in a very similar way as the Christians, someone that's been chosen or anointed, right? So the concept of choice runs throughout Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. That's by and large what ties it together as a concept of a Messiah or a Messiah. Does that make sense? Chosen for a certain purpose. So for the Christians, he's chosen to bring humanity into this 1,000-year period, depending on your interpretation, right? It's chosen to come back and battle al-Masih Dajjal, right, or the Antichrist. Chosen to bring the Muslims to a certain state, and so on and so forth. So it depends on your backdrop what he's chosen to. But there's a concept of being chosen. Oh yeah. Okay. So just to summarize now, there has to be a return of the Jews, physical return, and therefore there's no concept, or the concept of evangelizing the Jews has been put aside. Okay? That all is based on interpretations of the Bible that morph over time, specifically from a backdrop that is end times, right? That started with Paul himself, okay? So because there's the imminent return of Jesus, this imminent return of Jesus opens for many different interpretations. One of the ones that became dominant is that of dispensationalism. At the conference, we spoke about why dispensationalism, how Nelson Darby, how Darby brings it, or how it gets implanted into the U.S., into the Americas, and how it gets spread by something known as the Scofield Bible. And we spoke about Scofield and, and his own background, how he was not of the best character. He was a drunkard. He had stolen money from people. He had a wife and child who he abandoned. All sorts of other things, not the most best of character, but his Bible becomes the go-to, almost touchstone of what people were reading for a long time in the Americas, okay? That gets bolstered by other publications. So I brought one of them, and that's this one. It's called The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey. This is one of the best-selling books in American history, right? There's no exaggeration. It's a New York Times bestseller for a number of years. And for your information, the New York Times does not count Christian bookstores. So you can imagine that if it's a bestseller on New York Times and it doesn't count Christian bookstores, how much it would have sold. But this really shaped this apocalyptic understanding of the imminent return of Jesus and the restoration of the Jews to what they would call historical Israel, whatever it may be. Okay, so let me stop here. For some questions, because I know I gave a lot of information. There may be some clarification that's needed. Does everyone kind of understand overall? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, that might require another lecture for the question I'm going to ask.
Oh, dear.
Just how did the evangelicals convince the Jews of abandoning their interpretation of not having to come back to a single place if it was from a religious standpoint?
Sure. So one of the things is that circumstance is favored them. Because if you remember, what eventually happens is you have Nazi Germany. You have the persecution of Jews in Russia. You have, and by the way, it wasn't always just persecution, but in many parts there was persecution, deep persecution. And so when you're being persecuted, you can be kind of moved in a certain direction and say, look, our identity is no longer one of a Talmudic religious identity, but one that is more based on the concept of a nation and our lineage. And a reading of the Old Testament, you can find those sort of justifications, And so, so I think just circumstances, the fact that you have a nation state, the concept of the Jews themselves being in many parts of the world being persecuted and severely persecuted. In Europe itself, I always find it interesting that Muslims generally get the accusation of being anti-Semitic, and yet at the same time, if you look at anti-Semitism as defined as a hatred and a dislike of Jews, you find that at its apex throughout Christianity and throughout the European project, right, and the American project. I didn't get a chance to cite some of the pastors that support a return of the Jews to the Holy Land. They had anti-Semitic views themselves, right? And one of the reasons why the British wanted there to be a Jewish state and how they were able to convince many of the politicians to do that was because they said that Christian identity that we have, we want to keep it pure. And this is part of nationalism across the board, by the way. So even nationalism today, Like if you look at Hindu nationalism, it all goes back to keeping the nation pure, right? And that's one of the kind of the issues with nationalism itself. So that nationalism that arises in Europe and then spread across the world, you know, it's there as well. So if you have a British nationalism, it's how do you now keep this Christian British purity? And you also have, in addition to that, a returning of the Jews to the Holy Land, which is what we're supposed to do anyways. So it's like we're knocking two birds with one stone. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yes, way back there.
They're almost doing this for their own selves, right? Yeah. And so the moment that the rapture happens, all of the Jews are basically going to be destroyed.
Either destroyed or they'll convert.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Like us.
And I think Hal Lindsey, by the way, I think he gives a figure of 144,000. He's actually mathematically somehow, I don't know, Allahu Alam, how he did it, but he comes up with 144,000 Jews will convert, the rest, I guess, yeah. I don't know how he got it. So, yes, go ahead.
I guess from the contemporary perspective, like how is it that the Jews kind of understand that the Christians are out to either convert them or watch them be destroyed, but they're like, it's fine, but like let's agree to...
Let's agree to disagree, or let's agree to just hold. So what they did is, let's agree to hold it in abeyance. Let's just hang on to it. If the Messiah is according to what you say, we'll become Jews. We'll follow your Messiah. If it's according to what we say, you follow our Messiah. That's basically what it is, right? And so if your faith has now, from the Jewish perspective, if your faith is now shifted to when the Messiah comes, he will basically rule and he'll bring whatever he's going to bring, well, then you'd be like, okay, fine. We have to be back. We have to go back. We have to accelerate. And by the way, the acceleration of the coming of the Messiah is called aliyah. That's the Jewish term. So it's the acceleration of the coming of the Messiah. So the Jews basically at this stage now, or the Jews that hold that view, I don't want to say all of them, because remember we said not all of them held that view, leisu sawa, right? So the ones that hold that view are going to say, okay, when our Messiah comes, you know, if he's the Messiah that we talked about, you know, you follow that. And if it's Jesus the Messiah, then you become Christian and you follow Jesus, right? And until then, because we both have this overlapping objective, goal, that there should be a meeting of minds for that, a meeting of efforts for that. So let me get one more from there and I'll come back here.
Yeah. Why are the Jews trying to accelerate?
So why are the Jews trying to accelerate?
Like the coming of their Messiah, like producing the red calf that has no hair. That's
yeah. A lot of that, again, I would say you could peg it back to this nationalistic understanding, right? That we as a nation, because we've now formed and we're now here, we have a right to do this. And keep in mind that there's a section that I spoke about at the conference, which I entitled Dehumanization. And it was going back to that story of Noah, in the sense that those other sons of Noah are basically, especially Canaan, the son of Ham, which eventually becomes the brown people, black people, and people of color, by and large, they're supposed to be enslaved to the Semites. So now, if the idea is, now you want to enslave people, the Messiah comes and the world is, as I said, the world is your oyster. You can do whatever you want, have all the luxuries you want. So from one perspective, that acceleration serves a certain, how do I put this? A certain superficial purpose, if that makes sense, right? That we can now secure more power, have more people that are enslaved to us. And again, that happens by way of a type of dehumanization.
Is it almost like a propaganda tactic? Like Netanyahu, for example, he wants that to happen under his leadership.
Of course. I mean, what leader would not want the returning of the Messiah to be under him? And he's like, here he is, right? I mean, in any circumstance, right? I mean, I would even say, even as a Muslim, wouldn't you want to be the person who's leading the salah when Isa alayhi salam comes and says, why don't you step back? I mean, why not, right? So, yeah, that's understandable. Yeah, there's another question. Yeah.
How much of this would be occurring if there was no oil in the Middle East? We'd be in this situation.
I'm putting something.
There was a quote that I read. I don't remember who said it. He said, you know, the evangelicals are willing to sacrifice all the oil of OPEC for a few oranges they find in Israel. So would it? I don't know. You know, obviously there's economic realities.
I'm just wondering how much is this just a deception about like this about it's about more about a Western imperialism, you know, about the expansion of power control, protecting them from Russia and China, like this global hegemony. I'm wondering if that's what this is really about. And they're using this as a form to see the people to think that this is a religious endeavor, and that, you know, it's about the Jews and, you know, the poor Jews, and like how much of that is just a psyops here?
How much of that? So if you look at it from a historical vantage point, right? Okay, so that's what I was actually, the next section that I was kind of covering, right? Like, where are we today? Because there's certain economic realities of the American project that most Americans don't want to come to terms with, right? And that has to do with what we call declinism, the decline of an empire. And there's a whole course we do called Culture Wars, where we talk about that, kind of the pros and cons, and who are the people that support the idea of a decline of the American empire, and who's against it. Economically, from that vantage point, it's very difficult, especially when you see China as a rising power, specifically economically, to not recognize that there is a decline that's happening in the American project, okay? And other ideas and other concepts from historical analysis. But I think once you look at the economics, you'll find that it's clearly indicative of that. And even some of, I don't know if I should open this gate, but even some of Trump's policies, I think it was Dr. Richard Wolff who said, you know, he's kind of seeing the writing on the wall, and there's a concept in football called the Hail Mary, right? You guys familiar with that? Right? So he's saying that he's basically throwing, you know, it's on this way down, and you've got someone in the end zone, and it's just like, let's try it, right? So tariffs, boom, he's just going to do it, right? It's a desperate attempt. Now, obviously, there's a lot more economic nuance and analysis that's outside the scope of what we're talking about. But in other words, where we are today, it's an interesting question when you juxtapose that with where is the American empire today, right? And the various opinions in that domain. And I'll touch upon that just at the end here and give us some food for thought, inshallah. Any other questions?
Yes, very quick. Was even Canaan alive when Noah made his curse at that time?
The children of Ham?
Yes.
I don't know.
Okay.
Not sure.
When I looked it up, Canaan wasn't even in the picture. Like Ham,
right.
I don't know if he was even married.
That would be another aspect that you would say.
Yeah. Just,
you know, like, why would a prophet do that at the end? Again, it's how we understand prophets. You know, there was there's a very famous daya. Where's Abdullah? No. Yusha Evans. So, you know, he said something interesting. He said, you know, the Bible led me to Islam. And he says, you know, when I read the story of Noah and I saw that he was drunk in a tent, passed out, he said, you know, I had a lot of relatives that were alcoholics. And I thought, this is the person that's supposed to lead humanity, be the leader of his people, because it just didn't reconcile, right? Sorry?
He said, no wonder no one was following him.
Right, yeah, no wonder no one was following him, right? So, I mean, those are elements that, you know, we don't ascribe that to prophets at all, you know? So, anyways. Any other? I'll take one more. Yeah.
You said that Zionism is a political movement and not associated with Judaism?
Yeah.
So, what do you think the Muslims' response should be to this political war, I would say?
So that is an entire talk in and of itself. Like the appropriate response, how we move forward. The appropriate political response. Again, that would be a whole talk, because what overlaps here is, where's the American empire? How are we looking at it economically? What sort of, I guess, agency does the Muslim community in the US have? And what sort of agency does the Muslim community across the world have, right? And all of those things would have to be analyzed. My own personal, and this is just me, for me, I think that one of the ways in which we deal with the situation, and at the same time we kind of save the American empire, I know this might sound a bit strange, is by way of inviting people to Islam. Because at the end of the day, it's that sort of divine help that people are looking for, those deeper existential questions. Why am I here? Where am I going? What happens when I die? That warrants that divine help from an Islamic vantage point. If that makes sense.
You were talking about Luther.
Martin Luther.
Luther's?
Yeah.
Okay, so his response to the Turks was that they were a divine punishment for the weakened state of Christianity.
Yeah.
Do you think maybe there's some overlapping parallels with the weakened state of the Ummah? And maybe that we should have more of a defensive stand.
Well, what do you mean by defensive?
Like, going to war, maybe.
Yeah, so like I said, as far as the response of Muslims in America is what I'm talking about, right? So we're not supposed to go to war or fight or things like that. We have to use other tools that are at our means, right? That are at our disposal. And one of the main tools and one of the main jobs that we should be doing anyway, irregardless of Zionism and the situation in Gaza and so on and so forth, is inviting people to Islam at the end of the day, right? Because we want, if we're true to our faith, the goodness and those deeper existential answers that we have, we want to have our neighbors have that, right? So, I always gave the example in one of my classes. I said, imagine if you black out right now, you black out, and all of a sudden you wake up and you're in a plane. You're sitting in first class, right? So just have the thought experiment with me. You're sitting in first class, everything's comfortable, the scene outside is great, the temperature is perfect. They bring you food. The food is your favorite. It's the best you've ever had. Now you were sitting here and all of a sudden you blacked out, right? And now you're on a plane. So the question is, would you be happy? Now you might say, well, yeah, I'm in a really comfortable chair. It's first class. The temperature's perfect. The food it's like the best food I've ever had. There's like a beautiful orange hue outside. So everything seems really great. But underlying all of that would be some sort of bugging questions, right? Like, wait a minute, I was sitting in Qamariya and I blacked out. One question would be, how did I get on this plane, right? Another question might be like, where's the plane going? And another question might be, why am I on this plane, right? If you think about life as a metaphoric plane, we come to a certain state where those questions become important to us. Like, okay, I'm a conscious being. Why am I here? Where is this metaphoric plane of life going? And what happens at the end? Who's the pilot, right? All of those questions, existential questions, Muslims have the answer to that, right? We're here because God created us. Our purpose is to worship God. And where we're going is when we die, we'll be judged, okay? Clear answers. The majority of people have existential discomfort, right? And so that existential discomfort, what does it say about Muslims who don't want to share that comfort with others, right? So that's kind of, I would say, from my perspective, it should be Dawah-centric, because at the end of the day, and you'll find, and by the way, it should be Dawah-centric not only from our vantage point, because we are people who at our core and should be our hallmark is mercy and compassion for others. But even besides that, how many people have seen what's going on in Gaza, and because of that, they came to Islam? Because they saw that those people there, having nothing, having not even food to eat, losing limbs and children, and yet they come out with their head up high. It's because they have an existential comfort that other people don't have, right? So anyways, that's my opinion about how we would move forward. And obviously that can be coupled with other things as well, protests and boycotts and things like that. And all of that, by the way, one of the objectives of having meetings like this is so that we bring people together and start to now think about these things, right? In a way that's academic and educated and kind of moving forward, And it's a good question, so.
Are you hearing anything, or is there anything going on right now where you can move that conversation forward? Not now, I mean, entirely.
I mean, we're hoping that as a lot of the people that are here, that we now start thinking and start looking at who are the people that really want to be involved in this. So I personally think that, or not think, but I'm hopefully going to be sending out a survey form. Who would want to be involved in something that's broader ranged, have their expertise, and that they could feed into that, inshallah. So, all right, so I need to conclude. Okay, I'll take one more question, but I need to conclude with the end.
Yeah, and how can we unpack the topic we learned today with people around us that are non-Muslim?
Very good. That's an excellent question. I don't know if I can get to that question, but it's a very good question. I will try. Okay. So where are we today? Now, in the grand scheme of things, what you see is, in a sense, and I want to leave you guys on an optimistic note, in a sense that the Zionist project itself is having a lot of trouble, meaning that they're losing ground in certain areas, okay? I don't want to just, so I'll give you some statistics that kind of give me some hope. There's a Gallup survey, and this is, by the way, this came out a few days ago. This was posted on the BBC. A Gallup survey taken in March of this year. So March was when? Yeah, 2 months ago, right? It's like, right? Taken in March of this year, found only 46% of Americans expressed support for Israel. The lowest in 25 years of Gallup's annual tracking. That's a big deal, man, right? While 33% now said they sympathize with the Palestinians. The highest ever reading with that measure. Now, this is the Gallup poll. So obviously polls have, they have biases, how they ask the question. So another survey, this one was done with the Pew Research Center. The Pew Research Center found that the portion of Republicans who said that they had unfavorable views of Israel rose from 27% to 37%. Now, if you think about Christian Zionists, you think about who is their bread and butter, like who are the main quintessential Christian Zionists, you'd find them in the Republican Party, right? Conservatives, as we call them. And if the support now moves from 27, or sorry, the unfavorable view of Israel moves from 25% to 30. Oh, I say that right? 27% to 37%. That's a major boost. And this is something even in media that we're seeing, right? There are certain conservative, what you might call pundits, that are very well known that are clearly calling a spade for a spade and saying, look, this is a straight up genocide that's going on out there, right? And to say otherwise, in many of these people are saying it's anti-Christian, right? If we truly hold to what Jesus is saying, then you can't really support the annihilation and decimation of an entire populace, right? And the ethnic cleansing of an entire populace. Okay, I'll give you one more. Another survey that was taken on March this year again. 53% of Americans express an unfavorable opinion of Israel, an 11-point increase since the last time the survey was taken in 2022. So in terms of popular opinion, it seems like it's moving in a direction that's there to support the Palestinian cause and away from the idea of supporting Zionism, okay? My own kind of analysis, and I'll go through it briefly, but I've spoken it on other platforms, was that when you compare the protests that happened during the Vietnam War, and you compare the protests that happened, let's say, last year on college campuses, obviously there's the Trump is kind of locking down certain college campuses, you're not seeing the same. But when you compare those things, there are a lot of interesting similarities. So when you look at across the board generations, with the Vietnam War, there was a shift in media. So during the Vietnam War, if you studied the Vietnam War, remember that this is the first time that Americans have in their houses, being beamed in their houses, a visual of the war across the world, meaning Vietnam, right? Television sets are now showing Americans being killed. So you have a shift in media. A shift in media today is that you can live stream a genocide on your phone, right? So that's one similarity, the shift in the media. Another similarity is the fact that they were primarily youth movements, both in Vietnam and when you looked at the movements here in related to Gaza and Palestine. Why do I care whether it's youth or not youth? Well, because when you look at the youth movements during the Vietnam War, they represented a generation that was coming after what was known as the silent generation, okay? So you have the greatest generation. They experienced World War I. Some of them experienced World War II. They were the greatest because they were able to go through those wars, etc. Then you have the silent generation. Everything is going good. The economics are going great. 1970s, 1960s, 1970s. After World War II, we became the economic superpower. You could have a nuclear family and there could be a husband, wife, you could afford things. Great. You don't need to go out and protest, everything's great. But the generation after that, that sees Vietnam, these are the children of the silent generation, children of the rich and wealthy, who don't have any sort of fear when it comes to protesting or being arrested and so on and so forth. Let me juxtapose that with the people who are protesting now. You look at 9/11. The people that experienced 9/11, the Muslims that experienced 9/11, they're primarily coming from an immigrant population. An immigrant population that when it goes through 9/11, what are they worried about? Cheddar cheese, right? Rokra, as they say in Urdu, right? Money. Because why did they immigrate? By and large, and I'm not trying to knock anyone or anything like that, by and large, they came for economic reasons. And so when that gets threatened, now the response is that we have to now buckle down. We have to be as American as possible, hang the American flag outside of our masajid and our houses and so on and so forth. And we're like you, you're like us, and let us all come together, right? And hold hands and sing kumbaya, okay? This population, by the way, the Muslim population is one of the most wealthiest minorities in the U.S. So maybe after the Jewish minority, the Muslims come either second or third in terms of affluence. After that generation, many of us lived through 9/11, you have young people. Just like the people that came after the silent generation, you have young Muslims that came after the 9/11 generation of Muslims. Are they going to be inhibited by fear? No. Were the people in Vietnam, the protesters, inhibited by fear? No. Why? Because they never experienced financial hardship and this and that, right? For better or for worse. Sometimes we say our kids are entitled because they don't know what real life is like, right? But at the flip side, they don't have the fear that many of us would have. Like, are you going to go to protest? You're going to go to jail? You're going to lose your job? Et cetera, et cetera. So second was the youth movement. So we said there's a change in media. There's a youth movement. I would say the only differential here would be Islam. That's why wherever Vietnam led to, although it led to the end of the Vietnam War, some would say, I would say that because the people that are front and center of these protests have a backdrop in Islam, you're going to find, inshallah, that they have that force. In addition to that, just a general sense of justice, they have the sense of an obligation to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And that's something that I think we should not discredit and downplay. That's very important. And that's something that we should support. So anyways, I'm going to stop there. I know that many of you may have more questions, but I've been given the signal because we have to wrap up by 11. I know we said we'll go to 11, but because we have to rearrange our chairs and stuff like that, we'll have to stop now. I'll stick around for a little while if you want to ask me some questions personally. But with that said, I wanted to thank all of you for coming, spending your time here, listening to me. If there's anything of benefit that I said, that's all from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if there's any mistake, any sort of something I said that was offensive or anything like that, that's all from myself and from shaitan. May Allah bless all of you, increase you in khair, increase you in goodness. May He make your attendance today heavy on your scales of good deeds on Yawm al-Qiyamah. And I hope that, you know, that as you leave here today, you remember Sapiens Institute in your du'as. You remember the people of Qamariya in your du'as. And if you can, this is my final pitch, if you'd like to give a donation to support programs like this, please reach out to Brother Abdullah, I don't know where he went, or myself, and we can guide you in that space as well. And we hope to have more future programs. We'll be sending a survey out as well to see what you guys thought of this one, how you like the setting, and how we can make improvements. So may Allah bless all of you. Jazakumullah khair. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik.